Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for making it to my launch. The strangest thing happened when I was preparing this video. I went looking for some large books on which I could put the laptop to spare you the experience of looking at a massive chin and jowls. And I saw a couple of tomes that looked perfect in a part of the bookshelves that I haven't touched for years. So I pulled them out, and from between them, out fell this yellowing document, crudely stapled and badly stained. And I couldn't help but chuckle that at that moment, with Bulawayo in my thoughts, I had to find this. I have four important connections with Bulawayo. One is going to Evelyn from 1963 to 67 under the headmistressship of the intimidating and towering Miss Winifred Powell. And the second is my eldest daughter, Emma, was born there in 1976 at the Mater Dei. The third is that two of my most ancient friends, Pete and Verity Mundy, live there. Ancient in terms of the longevity of the friendship, of course. They themselves are mere spring chickens. And the fourth is far more recent, my connection with Pastor Albert and Di Charsley, and the wonderful work they do in and around Bulawayo, bringing food and comfort and love to hundreds of people. And when we started talking about doing a launch, I suggested to Irene and Di that we make the event a fundraising one for the Zimbabwe Victim Support Fund, which is a charity that backs Pastor Albert's work. And they were up for it. Verity was up for organizing it with Di, and then along came Violette and Paul, who were also up for it. So here we are. Then A Wind Blew is the first novel I've written, and it's been a real learning. I spent much of my professional life wielding the red pen through other people's sentences, paragraphs, sometimes whole pages, always, I hope, sensitively and constructively. Having retired, my current and only victim is my husband, Jim, who's a novelist. And only now, after having written a novel myself, do I understand why, when he hands me the latest chapter of his latest book, he does so with great trepidation. There's no joy there. Writing fiction, molding the interplay between context, plot, characters, dialogue, narrative, and style into something seamless and coherent really does stretch the little grey cells. And by the time you've finished it, you've been so immersed in it that you have absolutely no idea whether it's any good or not. And you wait with trepidation to see what your first readers think. Writing the novel was the hard bit. The easy bits were the bits that came before and after. The before was the research, reading everything that the British Library and other sources had to offer on the subject, as well as meeting others who'd researched the period, such as Patton Shlobu, whom some of you might know, who'd conducted a lot of research on the camps and interviewed many women who'd been in the camps. The after has been the marketing, exploring all the avenues to marketing, exploiting the social media opportunities to the point where my fingerprints are almost worn away. UK friends helping me gain access to people who might provide value and endorsements, like the journalists Matthew Paris and Christina Lamb, and politicians Kate Hoey and Nicholas Soames. And then starting to get early feedback from readers, some of them known for a long time, some of them new to me, some I'd known of but had never met. For example, a call came a few weeks ago from Switzerland, from Sally Roshnik, who's the daughter of Guy and Molly Clattenbrock. And we talked for going on 2 hours. Another call from the journalist Peter Thornycraft, who some of you might remember, offering to help publicize the book in South Africa. Another delightful 2-hour talk. Fittingly, one of the comments that meant most to me came from Bulawayo, from Judy Carter. She wrote, "I thought this was an excellent, albeit distressing read. It is very well researched, honest and brave. Kay writes like an artist who paints not because she wants to sell her paintings, but because it is an expression of truth. Thank you, Judy. That, in a nutshell, is all I wanted to achieve with this novel, to tell the truth. And thank you also to everyone who's put this evening together, Di and Verity, Violette and Paul, and thanks as ever to Irene for taking on my novel at a difficult time for publishing in Zimbabwe. My final word is for Pastor Albert. In January last year, before the COVID doors started closing around the world, Jim and I were in Zimbabwe, and with Di and Pastor Albert, we went to visit some of the 2,000 plus people that he is helping. It was heartbreaking to see how they were living, but eye-opening to see how vital Pastor Albert's work was to their survival. Pastor Albert, I feel very privileged to know you, and I do hope that the proceeds from tonight help bring a little comfort to some of the people that you have taken under your wing. And now I will do a short reading from the book, and after that answer some questions. There are 3 leading characters in my novel, all women, and this reading focuses on the character Nyanyi, who's been in a Mozambique camp as a nurse, not as a combatant, and after a stint in an assembly point when the ceasefire started, she's now coming home. She doesn't know if her mother has survived the war. All the way along the road, she saw thin cattle and empty huts and cut telephone lines and abandoned stores and schools. So when she got to the Inverary Valley, she was not surprised to see the same there, abandonment. In her own village, Nyanyi went from the burnt remains of one hut to another. She felt her mother's presence, heard her. Why do you not go out and play under the white moon anymore? Nyanyi walked along the path to Croggan's place. When she got there, a big bird flew up from the chimney and she flinched. It disappeared over the woodland. Some of the old walls had tumbled down a bit more, and in some places on the ground, there were still shell casings. Then she saw that there were beads too on the ground, blue glass beads. She stared at them. She knelt down. Shungu, her cousin Shungu. One by one, she picked the beads up, held them in her hands. Shungu in her red dress, Shungu with her baby on her back. Nyanyi stared at the beads in her hands and saw that day in her head, saw what she had seen that day, what Kundiso had seen, suffered. Saw all those days since that day, the sickness, death, hunger, weeping, blood. Nyanyi threw her head back and cried out, a long moaning cry that shattered the stillness of the place. And then she crumpled down and bent over and held her stomach, sobbing. She stayed there hunched over, sobbing for some time. So much pain, too much pain. When she was quiet again, she sat up slowly and wiped her cheeks with her hands and shook herself. She sat there. The bird came back and she heard a twig breaking. See? A boy was there, standing against the archway. Nyanyi stood up and went to him and asked him where he was from, where his village was. She thought that maybe on the other side of the valley there would be someone who could tell her the story of her mother. She followed the boy along the river to a place where there were many rocks in the river and they could cross. When they came to the boy's village, Nyanyi asked about her mother, but no one there could tell her anything. She went to some of the other villages, and in one of them, some elders said that they had heard of a woman who had been found wandering in the Inverary Hills about a year ago. One elder said he thought she'd been taken to Mandura Hospital. Nyanyi went there. Attached to the hospital was a unit for long-term patients who were suffering from mental disturbance, one part for whites, one part for blacks. That was where she found her mother. The nurses said they did not know who she was because she did not talk, did not communicate in any way. She'd been brought there with nothing except the dress she wore and a blanket, both like rags. She was thin, and there was a scar across her forehead, and her mouth was deformed. Some of the top lip was not there, cut off. But when she saw Nyanye, she smiled and smiled, and the deformity went away, and life came into her eyes. And she reached up from the chair she was sitting in and took Nyanye's hand and held it against her face. And now to the questions. Verity asked some of the launch guests what questions they'd like asked, and this is what they came up with.
Kay, you seem to have done an amazing amount of research. What were your main sources of information?
Non-fiction accounts like Chris Cox's Fire Force, Tanya Lyons' Guns and the Guerrilla Girls, Martin Meredith's The Past is Another Country, various Road to Zimbabwe, Weaver Press's Mothers of the Revolution, a great source of information. David Court, Under the Skin, recent books like Glenn Cross's Dirty War on the biological warfare aspect, and then way back books like Robert Blake's History of Rhodesia, anything I could get hold of on the nonfiction side. And of course, memoirs and biographies, biographies of Ken Mew, Fei Chung, then Lawrence St. John's Rainbow's End. And then there were loads of memoirs, personal memoirs on the internet, both civilian and military. A lot of people who fought in the war on both sides have posted something of their experience of it. Fiction, Mungoshi, Ivan Vera, Chinyoja Hove, Alexandra Fuller, Stani Nyamfakudza, a lot of fiction. Then research studies and history journals, especially the Journal of Southern African Studies, which was a great source. Then reading dozens of interviews that Marion Schlober conducted with women who'd been in the camps. That was a great source of information. A very interesting paper I came across, Gerald Mazarera's study of discipline and called Discipline and Punishment in the Camps, I think some such name. That's a fascinating, no-holds-barred study that does seem to explain, it did at the time to me, so much about how the country has been ruled in recent years. Newspapers, of course, local newspapers like the Herald and the Chronicle, to the overseas press, Times, Telegraph, piles of Rhodesian Ministry of Information documents and leaflets produced during the war. And then TV, of course, I watched some archive footage, a great program I found, BBC TV 1978, called Don't Quote Me, featuring a debate between the editors of the Times and Telegraph, with a ZANU-PF representative, Roger Riddell, who many of you will be familiar with, well-known economist in international aid development, and a few others. That was fascinating. And of course, there's masses on YouTube in the way of, old archive footage to watch. Although I was in Zimbabwe in 74 to 79 and later worked on such books as Ken Flower's Serving Secretly, when I was researching the novel, I was struck by how little I really knew. And it was tough reading some of that stuff, very hard to take in. But I wanted to get as close to the truth as possible, both the factual and the emotional truth. That desire to put down the truth occasionally included me lifting almost verbatim some words from a personal memoir at the massacre in the guerrilla camp that I write about, for example. I have this phrase, death crawled everywhere. This came straight from one of the women that Marion Schlober interviewed. Another example is something said by one of the perpetrators of the massacre. And I have this in my book. I've slightly changed the words, but this is more or less what he said. After a while, I stopped firing. I just sat there, watched, hundreds of eyes, mouths wide open, terrified. You know what I thought? I thought, this is how people look who die without God. After 2 years of reading, I began to formulate a vague idea of the story and started mapping it out. In the third year, I started writing, and I finished it in the fourth year. I then asked a very successful novelist friend of mine if she'd read it. And she said, "What draft is it?" And I said, "The first." She replied, "Not interested, not until it's at least a third draft." So back to the drawing board, and about 6 months later, I sent her the fifth draft. But when you start getting the feedback that is now coming in, well, all of that work, all of that research that I did does seem well worth it. Just today, a message came in from someone whose opinion I very, very highly when it comes to both writing and to Zimbabwe, from Matthew Paris, a columnist for the Times, a BBC radio and TV presenter, and an ex-Zimbabwean. He wrote, "We who were close to it saw the Zimbabwean conflict as a man's war. There is no such thing. And Kay Powell has channeled the voices to tell us so. Women's voices with sad, brave, moving songs on their lips. How did we not hear them?"
What motivated you to write this story now?
I had two motivations, really. One was that my daughters, who were both born in Zimbabwe, have long asked me questions about it, and I've never really felt I've answered them full enough. So the novel was a way of making up for that. The other reason for writing it was that I've always wanted to try my hand at fiction and was fairly certain that when I did, it would be about Zimbabwe. But for much of my adult life, I was a single mum full-time with a full-time job, so there was never much time for such a venture. It had to wait until I retired.
As a child of Africa, long settled in the UK, what do you feel about Zimbabwe today?
Sadness that things have not worked out as they should have for so many people there. Hope, though, in the way the younger generation are challenging the authorities, the way the young are doing worldwide. There is so much to challenge. Us baby boomers have left much to tackle. Admiration for the resilience and resourcefulness of Zimbabweans in very difficult times. Most of all, what I feel about Zimbabwe is it is just as much under my skin as it ever was. Its colors, its scents and smells, its skies and landscapes, all unbeatable for me. And the sounds, the call of a Cape turtle dove, so prevalent in the Zimbabwean bush, or the singing of a group of African women or children. Bliss.
One of your characters, Beth, talks about being a guest in this country. Is that how you perceive those whites who remain here?
No, not at all. None of the views expressed in the book are mine. They are the characters' views. Beth is based loosely on someone I knew at St. Francis Mission near Usapi, a nun, the only white person there. And when I once asked her in the 80s if she'd stay in Zimbabwe, she said, "I'm a guest in this country. I'll stay as long as they let me." And I found that answer intriguing. Part of the reason for her stance was that her real home was England. And she was part of that group of whites who said home when they meant Britain. When I was growing up, many of the adults around me talked about home. And I remember being puzzled. If England was home, then what was Rhodesia? Anyway, in this novel, I wanted to cover as wide a spectrum of opinion as I could. And when I recalled what the nun had said about being a guest, I thought it should be on that spectrum.
Do you have any plans for another novel set in Zimbabwe?
I really don't know. Writing a novel is tough. I need a break from this one, and then I'll think about it. Would you come back to me with that question in a few years' time?